Tony Harrison lives in the northeast, and the book that's in front of our readers is V, a long poem published just over 30 years ago, a poem that begins with a visit to his parents' grave in Leeds, which he finds desecrated by vandals. It caused a great furore in the 80s because he doesn't stint on the breadth of language he uses, and it remains a great entry point into the work of Tony Harrison, a man who, when it was said by someone in the 1990s that he might be Poet Laureate one day, said he would rather be free with no buts. Tony Harrison, welcome to Book Club.
Thank you very much.
V. Now, take us through the thinking for the title.
Well, I noticed in an earlier draft that I had something that said versus V's, and versus is against, and it also sounds like verses, so that stuck in my mind. But also one of the chief graffiti that was on the graves in my parents' cemetery where they were buried, not only all the four-letter words, but V's. And it was usually to express hostility, versusness,
Something against something
else.
The
team. And in shorthand, we use it for versus Leeds versus Derby, Leeds versus Manchester, so on. And I grew up during the Second World War in Leeds, and I helped to whitewash this V on a brick wall near our house during the war. Nobody had any problem with V. There were V's everywhere.
V for victory.
V for victory. And all these components and opposites, all these verses, if you like, are into how I thought about V itself.
Because in a way you're writing in the poem about conflicted feelings, about your sensibilities when you saw what had been done to your parents' grave. All these things come together. And I suppose the point about things still being in opposition is that you didn't find any of these things giving you an easy answer.
No easy answer. And I think that's why I wrote the poem. I wrote the poem to find out these contradictions. That's what I do, because I can keep contradictions alive in poetry that I can't keep alive in my ordinary thoughts.
You mean poetry allows you to keep them going rather than settle them artificially?
Yes.
Let's have the first question from our readers here.
The poem was written and broadcast some 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And in both the poem and the broadcast, you spoke with passion and fervour in response to the desecration to your parents' tombstone. What emerges within you now, when you're reading about the feelings and thoughts, some of them were angry, you were seeking to find some solution?
Yeah. I don't reread the poem often, except 2 years ago when I re-recorded it for Radio 4. In one respect, I know that the Friends of Holbeck Cemetery have taken over the cemetery, and it's a hard thing to believe, but when I went about 2 years ago to get some flowers, you go through the gate, there's a big board, finely done, showing how to get to my parents' grave. and there's a railing where it overlooks Leeds United Ellen Road football ground, in which V's are incorporated in the design. It made me think of how I got into the metre, the quatrains, the four-line metre of the poem. When I was in the 60s working in the British Museum, there was an Italian professor I became friendly with, and he had students that he wanted me to take to Stoke Poges to read from Gray's elegy written in a country cemetery. So I used to take them to the cemetery and read the poem. So that was deep in me, going to visit the cemetery. And then I suddenly thought, oh, I'm becoming my own Stoke Poges.
Was there any graffiti still there when you went back?
No, not now. It's well kept, beautifully kept.
And in a strange way, your poetic impulse did that.
Yes, probably the end result was that everything was cleaned up. Yeah.
You're going to be buried there, aren't you?
Some of my ashes are going to be put there, yes, and some are going to be scattered elsewhere.
What do you think about that? It must be a melancholy thought.
I think that's how we relish existence, the thought of mortality.
Well, let's talk about the existence of the poem. Yeah, we've got a question here.
Overall, I felt that there was a general feeling of dissatisfaction with life, but hearing you just then, I'm not sure now. Did you have a dissatisfaction of life in general when you wrote the poem?
I don't think so. I always tried to embrace my life fully. I had dissatisfaction with the class divisions of the country, the way culture was managed. I've written other poems about that. And this is now coming back, I think, in a way that was horribly irritating to me then. And I see it coming back, and I see some of the things I thought dated in V are coming back and don't seem as dated.
Like what?
The class divisions, not the miners' strikes, the miners have gone, but the other industrial problems.
And the curious thing about the poem is that it does throw in front of you some very contemporary questions,
Yeah.
race relations, for example.
There are racial insults sprayed on the graves as well as all the four-letter words, and this was at a time when people were out of work and being hostile to incomers.
It's interesting that you've made a distinction there between dissatisfaction, which you didn't feel with life in general, with being here, and anger, which you did feel about many things. They're two different things.
Yes, social anger. But if you're a writer, if you're a poet, you always want to think, oh God, that was terrible, I want to do the next one. That kind of dissatisfaction is built into the life of writing.
Did it flow easily? I think you wanted it to be longer originally. You thought it might be longer, didn't you?
I did, but it was in my sonnet form. I chose from George Meredith's Modern Love, which is a 16-line sonnet, not 14 lines as in most of Shakespeare. And the 16 lines sometimes open up to become 4 quatrains.
You talk about the quatrains, and I think before we get our next question from readers, it would be good to hear you reading. You mentioned you did a reading for BBC Radio 4 a couple of years ago of the whole poem, without any of the attendant fuss which had caused such a storm in the mid-80s. No doubt we'll come back to that. But let's hear a section of the poem now, as read by you a couple of years ago on the radio.
Or more expansively, there's Leeds versus the opponent of last week, this week or next, and a repertoire of blunt 4-letter curses on the team or race that makes the sprayer vexed. Then push for time or fleeing some observer, dodging between tall family vaults and trees like his team's best ever winger, dribbler, swerver, fills every space he finds with versus V's. V's sprayed on the run at such a lick, the sprayer, master of his flourished tool, gets short-armed on the left, like that red tick they never marked his work much with at school. Half this skinhead's age, but with approval, I helped whitewash a V on a brick wall. No one clamoured in the press for its removal, or thought the sign, in wartime, rude at all. These V's are all the versuses of life, from Leeds v. Derby, black, white, and, as I've known to my cost, man versus wife, communist v. fascist, left v. right, class versus class, as bitter as before, the unending violence of us and them personified in 1984 by Cold-Board McGregor and the NUM. Hindu, Sikh, soul, body, heart v. mind, east, west, male, female, and the ground these fixtures are fought out on's man, resigned to hope from his future what is past never found.
There's a reference there, a few lines from the end, to Cold-Board McGregor, Ian McGregor, of course, who came in to resist the NUM on the strike through 1984-85, and that was clearly an event that moved you and engaged you very deeply.
Oh, certainly. It was all around in Yorkshire where I lived, and the miners' strike certainly did involve me and the politics of it. And I wrote the poem while the miners' strike was still on. McGregor originally had Thatcher's hatchet man McGregor or something, but it didn't quite fit the metre, so I was addressing all that directly, and I see in the recently opened cabinet papers that Mrs. Thatcher refers to McGregor as the only one who is as good as me.
It takes us back, doesn't it?
Yes.
Let's get another question from the audience.
I think anyone that lived in the 80s would relate to your list of versuses. And the one that particularly chimes with me is McGregor versus the NUM, as I was brought up in the North Derbyshire coalfield. If you had to rewrite V today, which of those versuses would you leave out, and what new ones would you perhaps put in?
I think most of the verses I put in are still valid in a sense. I battled for using my own voice in poetry. I've written poems like the one I wrote about not being allowed to read Shakespeare at school because I had a very thick Leeds accent. And I say, it's all right, buggers, then we'll occupy your lousy leasehold poetry. And amongst the things I did was to go back to things